Hello, and welcome to Bedtime Stories. My name is Frank Padour, and I'll be reading to you a Grimm Brothers fairy tale entitled The Shoemaker and the Elves. A shoemaker once became so very poor, not by any fault of his own, that at last he had only just enough leather left to make one pair of shoes. So one evening he cut out the shoes from this piece of leather and laid them in readiness to begin work early the next morning. He had a clear conscience, so he lay down on his bed and slept in peace. In the morning he rose and went to his work, but how surprised he was to find the shoes lying on the table beautifully made and quite finished. In his wonderment, he knew not what to say or even think. He took the shoes in his hand and examined them inside and out, but there was not a false stitch in either of them. They were beautifully made, indeed, quite a masterpiece of workmanship. The shoemaker placed them in his window, and very soon after, a customer came in who was so pleased with them that he'd offered to purchase them at more than the usual price. The shoemaker could, therefore, with this money buy leather enough to make 2 pairs of shoes. He cut out and prepared the leather in the evening, that he might to begin work next morning early with fresh energy. But he had no need to begin, for on entering his workshop there stood 2 pairs of shoes beautifully finished and ready for sale. He had no lack of customers now, for 2 came in and paid such a good price for the 2 pairs that he had enough money to buy leather for 4 pairs. This he cut into 4 pairs of shoes, which he laid ready for work the next morning. But, on coming down, as usual, there were the shoes quite finished and ready for sale. And so on it went. What he cut out at night was always completed by the morning, till he had nothing to do but buy the leather and cut out shoes. In fact, so much money came pouring in that the poor shoeman soon overcame all of his difficulties and became, as he had formerly been, a wealthy tradesman. Now it happened one evening, not long before Christmas, that after the shoemaker had been cutting out several pairs of shoes, instead of going to bed, he said, "My dear, I should like to find out who these good creatures are who help us every night in this way. Suppose we sit up and watch." The wife was overjoyed at the thought, and leaving the candle burning, they hid themselves in a corner of the room behind their clothes, which hung there, and watched with great attention. As the clock struck 12, there came into the room 2 pretty little elves, without a morsel of clothes to cover them, and seating themselves on the shoemaker's table, they took up the leather which he had cut out, and set to work so nimbly, stitching, sewing, and hammering with such swiftness, that the shoemaker became quite bewildered, although he could not take his eyes off of them. They did not stop work for a moment till all the shoes were completed and placed on the table. Then they skipped off the table and vanished. The next morning the wife said to her husband, "These little men have made us so rich that we ought to do something for them in return for their kindness. I will tell you what I have thought of. I am sure they must be almost frozen, running about naked as they do. So I mean to make them little shirts, trousers, waistcoats, and coats, and if you will get a pair of little shoes ready for each of them, I will knit some stockings, and then these good little men will be comfortably clothed from head to foot." "I shall only be too glad to help you," said the husband. So they set to work busily, and in a few days the clothes were quite ready. In the evening, instead of cutting out any more shoes, the man and woman laid out their gifts on the table in the workshop, and hid themselves as before, in a corner, to see what the little men would do. At midnight they came bounding in, and jumped on the table, expecting to see the leather cut out for them to begin work. But nothing was to be seen excepting these beautiful little clothes. At first, they were much surprised, but as soon as they understood that the shirts and stockings and coats were for themselves, they began to dress themselves in eager haste, and were so delighted that they danced and jumped about the room over the stools and chairs, singing, Happy little men are we, smartly dressed, as you can see, no more shoemakers to be. And at last danced out of the room through the door, and never came back to work any more. But after this, the shoemaker, who had been kind to those who helped him, prospered in everything he did, and neither he nor his wife ever wanted money again, as long as they lived. That was a Grimm Brothers fairy tale, entitled The Shoemaker and the Elves. Thank you for listening. Good night, and sweet dreams.